Greetings. I am a production editor at a small independent publisher, which will remain unnamed. A lot of what we publish are what you'd call coffee table books. The kind that people flip through when they're bored, but almost nobody ever reads from cover to cover. Bland pictorial histories of certain cities or states that are sold in regional gift shops, the occasional book of maps or biography, that kind of thing. It's very banal, but we get enough jobs and our books make enough money to keep the business afloat. We've been around for a while, and our name is somewhat known to history buffs and people who think they're an expert on matters that are either very insignificant or esoteric. We get a lot of unsolicited manuscripts and CDs full of evidently amateur work. Because we're small and we don't have a separate acquisitions editor position, the job of going through this quote-unquote slush pile gets passed around the office. Very rarely would someone find something worth publishing and pitch it to the rest of us, but it is our senior editor who gets the final say. For the last 9 months, I've been working on something more or less non-stop. A book that everybody at the office was very excited about. An individual, who I won't name, had contacted us to publish their rare archival photo collection, provided that we treat the subject matter with the respect and seriousness they felt it deserved. To use their term, these photos were all anomalies. That is to say, they depicted something out of the ordinary or otherwise inexplicable, something that usually had an interesting story to go along with it. It's not the kind of thing we normally publish, but the few samples the client sent in with their pitch letter were compelling enough, and once we had seen the rest of them, heard a few of the stories, and realized that none of these pictures were widely known, we knew we had something that would get people's attention. Fortunately, the client was very difficult to work with. The job took far longer than it needed to because the client refused to send more than one document at a time. They would send me certified mail, I would scan it, get it, and mail it back certified, and only then would we receive the next one. They seemed to think that they had an extremely valuable collection, and they were very paranoid about losing it, so they risked only one item at a time. We were maybe a third of the way through the production process when the client pulled the rug out from under us. Somebody had offered them a large sum of money for the photos, far more than we were offering it for the book rights, and this deal would happen on the condition that our book would be scrapped and the photos stayed out of the public eye. We demanded that the client meet with us in person to renegotiate our arrangement, which the client initially agreed to. Later the same day, the client got into an argument over the phone with our senior editor, and the matter was settled. We would have to shelve this book. The client hired a law firm who, by a method beyond my understanding, voided our contract. This law firm also sent someone to our office to make sure the materials were wiped from our computers. Because the vast majority of it existed on my machine, and I had spent literally months of my life on this project, I felt and still feel violated and bitter about this whole incident. That is why I'm making this video. I do not have the high resolution scans I made of the photos, but I did keep the working files at home, which I could use to experiment with formats on my own time. I simply extracted the 14 medium res placeholder thumbnails that my software created when I was laying out the original version of the book. I do not claim anything with regards to the veracity or provenance of these photos. This video is not meant to prove that the stories tied to the pictures are true. I am sharing them because I believe they deserve to be seen and not hidden in a private collection. The first photo is titled "The Collingwood Fire". This is the last known photo taken inside the Lakeview School in Collingwood, Ohio, before it was consumed by a fire on March 4, 1908, killing 172 students, 2 teachers, and 1 rescuer. The fire started when a ceiling joist ignited from a nearby steam pipe. Flames blocked the escape routes, leading to a panic and a stampede that trapped a large number of victims in a stairwell, where they were killed. Additional casualties were incurred when burning students jumped from the second and third story windows. Everyone in this photo specifically perished, except for Mr. Olson, seated in the far right in the back row. The spectral artifacts in the photo remain unexplained. The second photo is titled "Charlie Noonan's Last Interview". Charlie Noonan was an amateur folklorist who traveled throughout the South and Southwestern United States during the early years of the 20th century, collecting tall tales and stories of the supernatural. According to his wife, Ellie Noonan, Charlie was told a story one day by an Oklahoma farmer about a strange woman who lived alone on an isolated property in the Panhandle. The farmer claims the woman was not a woman at all, but something else, something that hid its true nature behind a headscarf and was never seen without a large dog by its side. Noonan was apparently intrigued enough to try searching for the woman during one of his research road trips. He was never seen again. Ellie Noonan was later contacted by a Tulsa pawnbroker who remembered reading about her husband's disappearance in the papers after finding his name engraved on a camera sold to him by an itinerant. The pawnbroker returned the camera, and Miss Noonan had the film inside developed in the hopes of finding a clue as to his whereabouts. This was the only photo on the roll. Unfortunately, neither the location of the property nor the name of the farmer who sold him the story was recorded in Noonan's notes. The third photo is titled "The Death of John Olsted". This prophetically torn photograph depicts a regimental color guard of the Union Army, 1 month before they marched into battle at Antietam, which was in September 1862. The man on the far right, named John Olsted, had the right side of his face and arm blown off by cannon fire at the start of the battle. It is unknown exactly when the damage to the photo occurred. The fourth photo is titled "The Axeman of New Orleans". Edouard Martel was an unsuccessful French photographer and inventor who traveled throughout the U.S. during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, trying to drum up interest and investors for a device that added a timer and automatic exposure features to Kodak's popular line of folding brownie cameras. During his travels, he took thousands of automated photos to test and refine his invention. Often he would wake up early, set up a hidden camera in an inconspicuous spot on the streets of whatever city he happened to be in, and then walk to a nearby cafe or bar, so that he could capture the candid scenes of daily life to remember his travels by. The best of these photos were selected for Martel's one and only gallery show in Paris, 1924. Unfortunately, Martel died penniless and unknown in 1955, and it was left to his daughter, Jeanne, to sort through the boxes and boxes of photos he left behind, to see what should be kept and what should be discarded. During this process, she came across this photo, taken in New Orleans on the morning of October 28, 1919, a few hours before Martel boarded a steamer ship and returned to France. It turns out that Martel hated motion blurs in his photographs because he thought they would reflect badly on the speed and accuracy of his lens. This prejudice made him cast aside and overlook what was probably the most important photo he ever took. The night before the photo was taken, the notorious and still unidentified serial killer, only known as the Axeman of New Orleans, had committed his last murder, hacking Mike Pepitone to death in his bedroom and then fleeing the scene just as Pepitone's wife was discovering the body. The fifth photo is titled "The Grand Caverns Cryptids." This photo was taken in 1895 by an amateur spelunker and photographer named Orrin Jeffries while exploring an unmapped section of Grand Caverns in southwestern Virginia. At the time it was taken, Jeffries was conducting photographic experiments using super long exposures to see if anything at all could be captured in the total absence of light, otherwise known as cave darkness. He would situate himself on level ground, extinguish his lantern, and then open the lens of his homemade box camera for as long as he could stand the darkness. During one of these experiments, he heard something approach from the deeper recess of the cave. Frightened, Jeffries abandoned his experiment and set off one of his blitz-lit flashes he used for taking traditional photos underground. According to the report he later gave to a local newspaper, Jeffries saw 3 humanoid creatures staring at him from the shadows and took off running in the other direction, not stopping until he was topside. Several days later, he returned with 3 other men to retrieve his box camera. This is the image that was recorded on the film inside. The 6th photograph is titled "The Harlow Twins." 1938, Evergreen Park, Illinois, which is just outside of Chicago. Billy and Steve Harlow were riding in the front seat with their mother Tammy when their Ford sedan collided head-on with a Chrysler. During the collision, the car spun in such a way as to impact 2 additional vehicles. Tammy Harlow survived, but the boys were ejected through the windshield and killed instantly. A crime scene photographer from the local newspaper took this photo as a crew of volunteers worked frantically to free John Downing, the driver of the Chrysler. It appears that Billy and Stevie stuck around to watch. The 7th photo is titled "The Sorensen Tragedy." The Sorensens were a Danish family who immigrated to the United States sometime between 1905 and 1906. They arrived with their eldest child, Anders, who was seen on the donkey, and settled on a farmstead in Missouri. 3 more children, Simone, Frick, and Mathilde, soon followed. This photo, taken in 1916, captures all 4 of the children a few weeks before the tragedy. The 3 eldest kids were apparently playing fort in the hay barn and must have fallen asleep. Their father, Niklas, drove a wooden hay sweep into the pile and dismembered all 3, in locations accurately suggested by the flaw in the photo. Mathilde, the youngest, was inside the house with her mother at the time and not hurt. According to the son of a neighbor later interviewed by the author, the donkey later died in equally hideous fashion by getting its head caught in a barbed wire fence and nearly decapitating itself in a frenzy to get free. This final detail cannot be corroborated. The 8th photo is titled "The Spectre of Viola Peters." Viola Peters was a well-born spinster who lived alone in the small rural town of McCaysville, Georgia. She was much loved in her community for her charitable contributions to the Baptist church, the soup kitchen, and the local orphanage, especially during the Depression, when those institutions subsisted almost entirely by her donations. In July 1935, Viola was raped and murdered by a drifter named Tom Cullen, who had worked briefly at a nearby copper refinery. Cullen proceeded to stay at Viola's house and violate her corpse for an additional 17 days before he was caught and brought into prison. A posse of enraged locals stormed the county jail, took Cullen, and lynched him from the old bridge over the Toccoa River. This photo, taken by Garrett Killian, witness to the lynching, caused quite a stir when it was published a few days later in the Atlanta Constitution. To most, it suggested that Viola's spirit achieved some measure of peace by attending her killer's execution, but, drawing from the fact she lived alone, some twisted minds saw in her forlorn countenance in this picture a longing to get one last look at her one and only lover. The ninth photo is titled "The Ghost of Sarah Eustace." Danvers State Hospital, formerly Danvers State Lunatic Asylum, was a Kirkbride-style psychiatric hospital built in 1874 on what was then an isolated site in rural Massachusetts. Like all Kirkbride asylums, it was famous for its Gothic architecture and its use of now outdated medical techniques to treat insanity. The facility also had a vast network of underground tunnels, which have been the focus of various legends and rumors. The most famous story concerns Sarah Eustace, a patient who escaped her ward in 1955 and snuck into the tunnel system. Despite multiple searches and a week-long lockdown of the asylum, Sarah was never seen again. A nurse at Danvers named Gail Malloy became obsessed with Sarah's story and spent many of her hours searching the tunnels for her remains. Though she never found a body, she did snap this photo in late 1966, which suggests Sarah Eustace walks the Danvers tunnels to this very day. The 10th photo is titled "The Stevenson Family Portrait." The Stevensons were a wealthy Boston family, proud of the industry and longevity with which most of the clan was blessed. This portrait, taken in 1945, was an effort to gather the oldest Stevensons together with one of the youngest. Amelia, age 102, was granted the honor of matriarch, while little Ophelia was the token child at 18 months. What the Stevensons did not realize until the photo was developed was that they had been joined that day by one of their deceased. James Pullman Stevenson, who lived from 1835 to 1932, is seated on the left between his niece Ginny and his cousin Alfred. He was easily identified by those present and remembered fondly as a rascally uncle known for pranks and dirty jokes. The 11th photo is titled "The Disappearance of Miss Yurno." During her later years, Josephine Yurno would take a walk every evening at dusk around her beloved neighborhood in Norwich, Connecticut. On November 12, 1935, she set out as usual and never returned. Extensive searches were conducted by a large team of volunteers and the Norwich Police Force, but no sign of her was ever found. 3 years later, Miss Yurno was found squatting in front of a neighbor's house, without a mark on her body and in perfect health. When asked where she had been, Miss Yurno was unable to understand the question. From her point of view, no time had passed at all. Against the advice of her neighbors and her doctor, she refused all medical treatment and resumed her life as if nothing ever happened, including her nightly strolls. Another neighbor snapped this shot of her in the fall of 1938. On the same date, in November of 1940, 5 years after her initial appearance, Miss Yurno would vanish again, and this time she was never seen again. The 12th photo is titled "The Fate of Sally York." The 1912 threshing of Sally York, aged 9 at the time of her death, in the cotton loom of the Norfolk textile mill, was one of a handful of such accidents that helped legislators push through the Keating-Owning Act of 1916, the first child labor law in American history. From the time of the accident until the mill's closing 4 decades later, workers consistently complained of cold spots, strange noises, and sudden taps on the shoulder when nobody was near. The mill's foreman never paid these complaints any mind until this photograph surfaced in 1932. It was taken by a traveling photographer named Benny Johnson, who promptly sold it to the North Fork Gazette for an unprecedented $10. The mill had shut down for Christmas holidays and was empty at the time. The photo was later blamed for the closing of the mill, though the Great Depression was the more likely cause of that. The 13th photo is titled Lily Palmer's Eyes. Lily Palmer was not quite 4 when she experienced what her doctors would call an acute onset of sensory hallucinations. This photo, taken by Lily's mother Annette on Halloween night 1952, purportedly captures the arrival of her disorder. Lily and her Filipino nanny were setting out for a round of trick-or-treating when the child suddenly screamed and began to claw at her eyes. It was some time before she was calm enough to speak, but when asked about what she saw, Lily repeatedly spoke about things crawling in her eyes. Several days later, while unsupervised in her bedroom, Lily punctured both of her eyes with one of her mother's knitting needles. After receiving medical treatment, she was evaluated and committed. She remained institutionalized for the rest of her life, first at Bellevue on the east side of Manhattan, and later at the Rockland Psychiatric Center in Orangeburg, where she remained until she died of a heart attack in March 2001. A call to one of her former caregivers at Rockland confirmed that Lily's episodes were most traumatic on and around Halloween night, but for the majority of her life, she could be heard begging and pleading with the staff to help her get these things out of her eyes. The 14th photograph is titled The Trinity Deception. This is one of several famous photographs taken of the first ever nuclear detonation. Conducted by the U.S. Army on July 16, 1945, in the White Sands Proving Grounds, about 35 miles southeast of Sirocco, New Mexico, the setting off of this implosion-designed plutonium device ushered in the atomic age and the eventual arms race between the United States and Soviet Union. Only a handful of people were ever aware that this photo was cropped before it was ever released to the public, and they are all now dead for various circumstances. One of them was the original photographer, who gave the author a copy of the original under the condition that it be kept out of the public eye until such a time that the citizens of the world could handle the ramifications of what it presents. The author remains uncertain whether this criteria has been met, but given that he likely owns the last extant copy, he has decided his responsibility rests with the truth.